Well, hello, good morning. I think it's Wednesday. Today we're talking about AutoPkg, we're talking about Casper, we're talking about JSSImporter, its newest name, this newest incarnation. Subtitle of this talk, Live the Dream. What is the dream exactly? What is it we're trying to do? We want to keep software, heaven forbid, we want to keep the software on our client machines up to date. And there's a lot of other things that we want to do that go along with that. Like, we'd like to test that software before we deploy it. People are into that sort of thing, I guess. I work in a private pre-K through 12 school, so the stakes are maybe not as high as they would be in other industries. But still, you know, we get a lot of enraged teachers if Minecraft doesn't work. I'd say that's probably the #1 issue that we face. We also want to try and minimize the amount of time and mistakes that we make. I've always, for some reason, really enjoyed updating software. I remember, like, on my first computer, I liked watching the little progress bars as things installed. That's a weird thing about me. I'm guessing most people are not that enthusiastic about watching progress bars and installing things. So hopefully we can find more time to do all the other things that we're not getting to in our lives, like unjamming paper jams and that sort of thing. And hopefully, if we have all this stuff automated and written down in a way that we can all collaborate on it with our coworkers, we can prioritize other stuff. We can focus on the things that are really important. So, like I said, in my environment, Minecraft apparently is a super important thing. Adobe Flash, maybe not so important. So we want to talk about a few little top-level things before we start diving in. Just want to remind everyone of some of the virtues of the IT worker, the computer programmer. Laziness, which ends up, of course, not being really particularly lazy, but, you know, the maxim that the time you spend coming up with a really elegant solution that automates things is probably time better spent than repetitively doing the same thing over and over and over again. I said trading one kind of labor for another. You know, I feel like this idea of being lazy ends up creating a lot of work. I like to try and automate everything I can because I don't want to have to click on stuff. I really hate that. And as a result, I end up spending all day answering emails and GitHub issues and stuff like that. So I don't really feel like ultimately it's made my life less complex or easier, but I find that task to be more enjoyable. And it's certainly not easy. I think we were just talking beforehand about how there's a big crowd here, and I think the reason for that is that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get this sort of workflow happening at the moment on Casper. You know, there's this vaporous promise of patch management coming, and no one knows when it's coming or how it works or anything. And in the meantime, I don't want to wait. So fortunately, somebody else started writing this stuff, and I was able to take over, and now we can do it. This idea of creating a safe space to iterate means that we want to be able to test the software, we want to be able to automate it so that people can get the software, they can test it without interfering with production environments. We don't have to monitor it that closely. It's just going to work, and it's going to be simple, especially for the people who, again, in my case, I'm dealing with teachers and students. And in a lot of ways, they're very technologically savvy, and in a lot of ways, they're absolutely not savvy. So we want to make it really simple for them. It's all in the reflexes. So I want to go over how Casper installs software. Probably 8 different ways, because there is no one way that it really does it. Obviously, there's one way in which it actually completes the task, but in terms of structuring how you install software, I've seen a lot of different approaches. You can make a policy, scope it to an individual computer or some small group of computers, and then install all the packages that you want that computer to have. Not recommended. You can also have one policy for each software product that you want to install, or one policy for each product you want to install automatically, and then another one for self-service because you want different frequencies. It can quickly balloon out of control. And, well, we'll get to that a little later. So the process usually is that you package some software up. Jamf would recommend that you use Composer. I would recommend that you use whatever you're comfortable with. I think yesterday people talked about Composer a fair amount. There's certainly other tools for making packages, and we'll be talking about one of them in particular. That package gets uploaded to your distribution points or your distribution server, whatever you're using. Somebody makes a policy, scope it. They scope it to the machines that are supposed to have that software, and then usually, at least the way I think most people do it, is you have the periodic check-in or the startup trigger, install that software, and you install it once, and it's done, even if it fails. So, if a installation policy fails, that's it. You have to go and flush the policy logs, and you have to monitor that sort of thing. And then when that software updates, you have to download the new version, test it out, package it up again, because, of course, they need to be packages. Unless it's something that gets installed in the root of the hard drive, then it can happily accept disk images. But that's probably not the case. So most things are probably going to have to get packaged up, uploaded to the distribution points, edit the policy to install the new version, and install the logs. And for me, the problem arises that I might do 5 or 6 or 10 pieces of software all at once. There's a pretty good chance that I'm going to whiff on one of those and click the wrong thing and forget to flush the policy logs or whatever. So, for example, that critical Adobe Flash update that is going to get X protected out doesn't get installed. And even worse, Java doesn't get updated, and then Minecraft doesn't work. So there's 2 points of pain in this process. One of those is that almost all software has to be repackaged. And manually doing that is a drag. Even if you have something in place to do that pretty quickly, I used to build a lot of packages with the luggage, and that made it pretty easy. Certainly, Composer can make it easier, but it's still a lot of manual labor and having to go and download the stuff. And do you bookmark it all? Do you still use Delicious or something for all your bookmarks? The other point of pain is clicking on a bunch of web forms to deploy. And I really hate clicking on things, and I really hate waiting for things to refresh. I think, at least, again, in my sector, I don't know for everyone, but people really like dedicated clients. They really don't like doing things in web browsers. And having to interact with the JSS on the web browser, I can kind of see that. So a lot of that is repetitive work. If you don't mind repetition, here's the cure for that. If you haven't seen the Hasselhoff infinite recursion before, it's a magical animation that I should probably just leave up here for the remaining 66 minutes.
I feel the wrath.
Yeah. You should. That's about enough of that. Really, I think, I paraphrase, but I think anytime you find yourself doing the same task again and again and again, that should be your cue to yourself, like, maybe there's a better way I can do this. Maybe there's a way I can automate this. The other big problem, in addition to repetition making our lives dull and monotonous, is this idea of quality control. We've got 2 ninjas here. One is representative of my perception of myself. I'm going to come in and solve all these problems and kick butt, and everything's going to be perfect. my katana will just slice through illusion and solve all the problems. And unfortunately, I'm probably more like this guy on the right. Just kind of sad. I make mistakes, lots of mistakes. And fortunately, again, in my environment, we're a lot more flexible. The stakes aren't quite as high. So, these 2 pain points, how do we solve them? Well, obviously, it's in the title of the talk. That's why you're all here. AutoPkg is the first one. Since we have to repackage everything, why not do it in a way that is repeatable and we don't have to really become involved with? Certainly, if you become somebody who likes to write recipes and you need to make recipes for software that's not covered in the existing repositories, that's great. It's a black box, okay? You don't really care what happens in the middle. I mean, you really should care what happens in the middle because you can't necessarily trust everyone. But for the most part, things wouldn't be in those official repositories if they weren't functioning and fairly trustworthy. It's certainly possible to have recipes that do all kinds of crazy stuff on your AutoPkg machine, but chances are good by the end of the process of getting this all set up and working, that's not going to be your personal machine. It's just going to be another machine somewhere that is a utility device and does this stuff for you. This black box idea, Godzilla is a big, mean, angry guy. We don't really care what his anatomy is, what goes on inside of him. Maybe this is a thin metaphor, but I liked the pictures. It's the same thing with AutoPkg. If you know that you need an Adobe Flash player package, you don't really care what has to happen in the meantime to make that package happen. Of course, you could just download it and it's already a package. Perhaps not the best example, but there are certainly other pieces of software that do need to get packaged up. And as long as you end up with a package, you're happy. It's tippy. Pain point number 2, having to click on a lot of web forms. There's this thing called Munki that really is a great model for this. And we can't have Munki on Casper as it, just by default without some work. We can't have it for free. We certainly can have both. I would assume that most people are here because they have Casper already and may or may not have implemented some kind of software management solution to handle this. I would certainly say if you have the freedom to use Munki, it is a great solution and one that I used for a long time, and definitely try and use that. That being said, sometimes people want to have all of their software installation operate through self-service. And while the managed software center, or whatever it's called these days, serves that purpose, if you have a lot of Casper plugins for the self-service app, for example, or you want to just have limited the number of places where people need to look for that stuff in your organization, this is a good way to solve that. But just briefly, what exactly is it that Munki does? I don't think we probably need to go super in-depth over it, but it handles the installation of these updates, and it does so in a really safe and automatic way. So you don't need to go and trigger anything, flush the policies, all that stuff. It knows, what software is installed on a computer. Is it out of date? Does that computer have access, or should it have the updated software? And go ahead and do it, unless, of course, something else is running. The big idea, I think, that I got out of running Munki was this idea of having different tiers of client machines or users in terms of who gets what software, and how do you determine that software is tested and safe to install. And usually we see these listed as development, testing, production tiers. I think in a lot of cases, again, a small organization, we kind of consider the development level at our school to be my computer. I'll install all this stuff and just say, hey, does it install? All right. And then there's this testing level where I have made a lot of the students, future IT workers of America, testing members. Certainly there's a number of faculty. Our technology coordinators have access to that. All the faculty have access to this stuff. And there's a real expectation, and we talk about it all the time with them, that this is software that they need to use if it's critical to their teaching or what they do on a day-to-day basis. We expect them to test it and report back to us and let us know. And only once all that stuff is working do we roll that out to everyone. So AutoPkg and Munki together are a great solution to this problem, and they already work together. I think they probably were designed from the get-go with that in mind, and they handle it great. You run an AutoPkg recipe, it gets thrown up into your Munki repository, and it's ready to go. And you can already go out and do that today if you had Munki set up. Add all the Munki recipes you want for all the software you want, and pretty much covers all the software that you would expect to need. Maybe not NetHack. So the Munki recipes itself, in the ideal case, are just an extension of a package or download recipe, probably a package recipe, but not necessarily. It really should only describe what needs to happen after this product has been made into a package. So it's kind of post-packaging. What happens? How do I get into my management system? If we abstract that a little bit and we're talking about Casper, we're thinking the same thing. This recipe should only do something on top of that package. We already have a package. Again, we don't care how it got built. Let's get it into our management system somehow. So this, not a super exhaustive list of what all happens in those, but the big thing here, in terms of what we're interested in, is this one, copies files to Munki repo. If we just copy a package to our distribution points, what happens? Nothing. Nothing happens. There has to be some kind of intervention, at least as it is installed, as it comes from the basic setup. We have to probably go and change all the policies that install Adobe Flash Player. Now we need to switch the package on all those. We need to go flush the policy logs, and then we need to spend the next 2, 3, 4 days, depending on how your remote systems check in with, your remote clients check in with the Casper server, to make sure that those policies all installed correctly. And due to some historical weirdness with what Casper interprets as a failure, you may get some false positives as well, or false negatives, stuff that failed that didn't actually fail. So we need to do a little more work than just copying the file up to the distribution point. And to be fair, that's not all that Munki recipes do, but that's a big part of it. So I was using Munki to manage all of the software at my school, and we had a big iPad rollout. Our whole middle school, all the students have iPads. We were contemplating it for the upper school students, and for us, middle school is 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. And we also have individual iPads, if you can believe it, for 4th graders now, and it seems to be trickling down further and further. We have carts for lower grades. So Casper or some sort of MDM was a really popular thing in my department. And we ended up going with Casper. And I really, really wanted to keep using Munki, and people didn't want that. Which is fine, that's a decision you make as a group. Fortunately, this guy, Alistair Banks, had done all the hard work and come up with a way to, as best you can, replicate a lot of the same things that that Munki recipe workflow in AutoPkg would do. So yes, this is not actually Alistair, but it's a guy in a really sweet Python sweater, which Alistair did some really sweet Python, so I thought that was appropriate. So anyway, just the quick history of that, I started getting involved in making annoying requests like, hey, there's no categories for policies. I'd really like to have that, and I'll just edit that and make it do what I want. And then, hey, I really need this thing. And I think eventually Alistair just got sick and tired of it and said, you know what, do it. And I think you don't even use Casper now, right? You know, it was something he was testing. So anyway, he did all the work. He created this idea, and I think it's really solid. It's based on a lot of experience that he's had and how to do this stuff. As I rewrote this thing, tore it all the way down and rebuilt it so that it could do all these weird things, and I started getting more messages from people about, hey, I'd really like to be able to just upload a package to my distribution point and not make a policy, not make a category, not make a smart group. I started abstracting all this stuff out, and so there's this other framework or package called Python JSS. There's no Python library from Jamf that interacts with the API as of yet. Maybe someday they'll make one. In the meantime, I wrote one, and it works, I think, is the #1 thing that you can commend it for. It's not pretty. I've certainly not had the programming experience to really know what I'm doing on something of that scale. I mean, it's thousands of lines of code. And it gets better every time I refactor it, and maybe someday it'll be a gleaming beacon of code beauty. But in the meantime, it gets the job done. And it allows you to do a lot of stuff through the API, through Python, that is a lot better than trying to do it through curl. And it enables a lot of what we're going to do. So keep in mind that this Python JSS is the underpinning for what's going to seem like a long, we've got 53 minutes left. A lot of this is going to seem like an infomercial for products that I've made. So really, this Python JSS drives a lot of that. So we have a number of rules that we kind of adhere to. Elliot Jordan and myself have been coming up with a style guide for our, I guess we can call it, official repository of JSS recipes that are now part of the AutoPkg organization. And they must adhere to a number of rules, some of which we'll talk about, but the whole style guide is out there. But the idea is that we want to make this a process that, again, this black box idea that you can rely on it to a certain extent to do what it's supposed to do and not go through and totally trash your JSS. I know one of the things that gets me all spun up is when I get on and all of a sudden there's like 5 new categories for things that are redundant with other categories that we already have. And then I have to go and find the people who did that and question them vigorously. I don't like lots of categories. I like a few categories. Anyway, one of these rules is policies should not install more than one product. We talked about this before, but it just becomes more work if you're trying to install multiple products with one package. I think that is a dead end. So you don't want to have a policy that's called, like, in my case, upper school faculty software. It installs Adobe Flash and, you know, Creative Suite and Oracle and all this other stuff. If that policy fails and you have to flush the policy logs, you got to run all that stuff again. It's time and bandwidth consumptive. Not good, not cool. The other thing that we are advocating, or I recommend here, is that each product, and a product being one software package, or each software product, okay, I want to differentiate between that, and there are instances that I can think of where you do need to install more than one package to have a product installed. Hopefully that is the exception to the rule, but in most cases it should just be a single package. We should have a testing policy and a production policy. And usually that production policy is going to be automated in the sense that it runs automatically. If you image a computer and it's scoped, it's in the right group, it should just get that software as part of its thin imaging workflow or even no imaging workflow. And likewise, when you do promote software to production, it just happens automatically. No user intervention needed. At the moment, we do all of our testing with a self-service policy. So those people who are in the testing group optionally get a notification that they have new software available, and they can go and install it when they feel like they want to fool around with it. It also means that they don't get all the testing software. They get the testing software that's in their work domain that they're actually likely to comment on and help us test. These production, by the way, the images are all called from a soon-to-be trickled out publicly. I said this was like a long infomercial. I have this giant collection of images which I think are awesome. It's called the Museum of Awesome Stuff. And that's, I think, almost all these pictures from that. So this speaks for itself, really. So these production policies probably should be bulk created. And the reason I say that is that, again, I make a lot of mistakes. And when I sat down and set the system up for the very first time, it was a daunting task to look at, here's my Munki catalog of all the software that I have, that I manage and that we're concerned with installing. Now I have to create a policy for each one of those, 90 different things or whatever. I'm trying to think, what would be a fair number of mistakes I make on 90 software packages? Like 90? There's a lot of distractions. For example, collecting pictures of cheeseburgers. So one of the things that can help with solving this problem is either creating a kind of template policy that you duplicate if you really want to keep working in the web interface, and just edit those things that are only different, so the name of the policy and what software it installs and who's it scoped to, or probably a better solution, and one that hopefully I'll have a more automatic feature added to another thing that we'll be talking about later, JSS Helper, that will allow you to pump these out based on a template so that you don't have to even do that typing the name thing. Because again, there's a lot of automation written into this, but in some ways it's very fragile. If the name of the policy does not include the name of the product, there could be problems if there's a typo or whatever. We need help. So hopefully it's going to be a near future thing that we can bulk create these policies. And I did want to talk about this thing, variants as documentation. What I like about the idea of scripting all this and being able to audit it and look at the policies, even if you just go and you grab JSS Helper or one of the other things that allow you to dump the actual XML file of the policies, is that you can then use diff to compare them and see how they are in fact different. And ideally, they're only different in their name, the category, and what package they install. If they differ in other ways, that means you probably screwed up somewhere. And so that's a great way to make sure that you can minimize the amount of mistakes you make. The other variances can possibly be, sometimes there needs to be some extra scripting requirements, rebooting and stuff like that. And the recommendation that I have for following this workflow that we use is that you install those policies with a name like this. So install, you can have a space, or if you want a hyphen or whatever, don't put an exclamation point, please. NetHack, and then the version. Again, separated by a dash or a space. But in that order would be nice. You can certainly, if you're a really large organization, for example, the UNC system in North Carolina uses one license, I guess, of Casper to manage a bunch of different universities. And I've never actually looked at their web interface, but I've had discussions with them, and they have prefixes on a lot of their stuff to differentiate between, this is ours, don't mess with our policies, and we won't mess with your policies. So certainly there's no reason why you can't say, production install or whatever thing that allows you to sort these in a way that makes sense for your organization. The way we deploy for testing, the official workflow as per the style guide, is that the package gets uploaded to all the distribution points. There's a self-service policy that is scoped to a group called testing. And of course, that can be changed to whatever with overrides and things. People test that software. And then when it's beyond somewhat reasonably tested, we promote it to production. And that promotion involves, like we talked about before, changing those things that need to change. So hopefully just the name of the policy and the package it installs. And spoiler alert, that can be automated, and it's automated as well. So we'll get to that. I did want to briefly talk about what exactly is testing. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, my test is, does it install and does it start? I don't know what else people are trying to do with it, and I don't feel like I should try to know what everybody's trying to do with it. We're not a huge school, but it's hard to know exactly what kinds of crazy things people are going to use software for. A good example being like iPhoto, we had a teacher use for a long time, teaching kids how to maintain the citations for images that they were using in keynote presentations, keeping the URL as metadata in iPhoto. And when new versions of iPhoto came out, that didn't work anymore. That's never something I would have thought to track. How do you track these citations? I would just write it down, put it in Evernote. So you need to have help doing the testing. And, I think IT plays a role in that, but I think that the end users need to play a role as well. If they're not willing to test it, if they can't be trusted to test it, then they probably have a list of requirements that they need it to work, and you need to make sure that it meets those before you promote it, rather than willy-nilly just installing software because you're like me and you love to install updates and watch progress bars. This self-service policy, the details are that it's scoped to a smart group. This is going to make a lot of smart groups. That's okay. You can have as many as you want. They're computers. It's annoying to see visually that there's a ton of policies, and there's now going to be at least one for every, possibly two for every software product. But again, with the use of overrides and our AutoPkg recipes, we can switch things around so that these all end up in one group and they can be collapsed in the web interface so that it doesn't bother your OCD need to have things not be crazily expanded. The policy frequency is ongoing. All right? Normally this is annoying because it'll just install a package and install it the next time it checks in and install it the next time it checks in and install it the next time it checks in. And sometimes, I make that mistake, and it does that for a long time. But ideally, it's going to install the package, and then at the conclusion of that package installation run, it's going to run a recon, and the smart group managing that NetHack Update Smart or whatever Firefox Update Smart group that we're talking about now drops out of that smart group. So the next time it checks in, it's not a member of the smart group. It's not going to get that policy that's scoped to it. It's just happily left alone. This is about as close as we can get in a lot of ways to that Munki workflow of automated installation. And there's some things that we still have to work on, namely blocking applications, the idea of not installing Firefox while Firefox is open. There are problems that we can solve. The problem is it's me solving it right now, and if anyone wants to send in a pull request on that, I'd happily add it in. It can be done. What can be done is that at the moment, we're probably all familiar with the fact that you can't do version comparisons in Casper. So not much we can do about that other than either use extension attributes to report some way about whether something is less than, greater than, equal to, or we're still using Alistair's original smart group idea, which is that it has these criteria on the right. The application title is Firefox.app. Okay? Application version is not whatever version that policy has been updated to install. So obviously this is like way out of date that I made the screenshot when we were only on Firefox 39. What are we up to now, like 44? Oh, really?
Yeah.
I thought I saw an email the other day that was like, updates. All right. Good. And the final part is that the computer needs to be a member of the testing group. And that's kind of the scoping trick that allows this to work. The caveat with the application title is that in a stock JSS, that inventory that tells you whether the application and title, which is kind of a difficult to understand idea, is only the applications folder, and maybe utilities as well. You can make it certainly also check for things like internet plugins, Flash and Java, but that's not how it comes by default. So one of the things we do with the AutoPkg recipes for those products is we have an extension attribute that checks for it just to save the administrator from having to change those inventory policies on their Casper server. It certainly is not necessary. You can put as many different paths into the inventory collection settings as you want, but then again, if you have to reinstall that stuff and whatever else, it's going to be hard to look through the database, I guess, of your crashed server to find all the different paths that you wanted to include. So hopefully the people who write the JSS recipes take this into account, and again, the official repository makes sure that there's some way for it to know if you can't find that application in applications, then we need to be able to find it somehow and figure out what version it is. So this is all you need to know. That's another Museum of Awesome Stuff comic strip. At this point, we've talked about like what does it do, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's pretty simple to go out and say, okay, I need to get AutoPkg, I need to get JSSImporter, I need to get these JSS recipes, and I'm ready to go. But we're going to talk a little bit about how those things work, how you set them up, because we've got lots of time. Let's get nerdy. This is probably the flimsiest visual joke in the entire presentation, since the last slide said relax. Anybody recognize these guys? I just thought that this one dude on the left had is it a unicorn tattoo? I don't know. Sweet mustache. And the mesh shirt. Almost wore my mesh vest for this presentation. But so we're going to talk about how to set all this stuff up. We're going to briefly talk about writing recipes, because that's a huge topic. We're going to talk about some alternate workflows if this doesn't do all the things you need to do, or to give you some ideas about other stuff that you can do. And I don't know what the mad skills part really insinuates. So where do you get this? Well, I think you can probably just Google it and it'll get you to the right place. But sometimes if you don't have any experience with GitHub, you might go over to one of these projects and say, okay, great, there's a README file and there's a list of all the files. Do I just download a zip? How does this work? So if you go to the releases page, at the top of that list should be the newest version. There's going to be a package that you can install, and you should install it. It'll do all the stuff behind the scenes that it needs, which is namely just installing Python JSS as a Python package. And that's a questionable practice, but one that works for the time being. To configure this thing, we need to specify a few things so it knows how to interact with our JSS. So the settings are API username and password. This is for a user that has hopefully been created for the sole purpose of auto-packaging. and management. Hopefully you're not just using your personal account, which has super admin access to everything. You need the URL of your JSS, including protocol and port. And you need to specify some repositories if you want it to do anything with those packages. I've also got JSS verify SSL on there. The default behavior is that it's going to verify SSL. And if you don't want it to do that, or if you don't have the ability to do that, you can turn that off. Let's see. Is this legible? Yes. So this is an example of just part of an AutoPkg preferences file that includes the relevant stuff. It's unnecessarily long, but you can see that those preferences are up there, the API username and password, URL, the verification status, and then the repositories. And the reason I'm showing you this is that there's two different ways of specifying the file shares, and this top one is really unnecessary. So don't use it. Ideally, you can just specify it like this. All right? You can say, here's the name of my file share, and here's the password. All the other information can be gotten through the API when you connect to the JSS. There's a little bit of magic that happens behind the scenes where Python JSS will grab the share name, the type, the username, the domain, port, anything like that. And unless something has gone horribly wrong, you don't need to deal with that. What you do need to do is create that user account, and it needs to have the appropriate permissions. So in this example, there's the web UI. More importantly, it needs read and update privileges for, create, read, update for the following types of objects. So that is one thing that maybe can be automated. Can you get to that through the API? Maybe this is something that can get improved in the future as well. It just occurred to me. Wouldn't it be great if we could just say, make me an AutoPkg user, gives it all the right permissions. We'll look into that. The little star at the bottom means that at the moment at least, even if you're not going to make policies or you're not anticipating needing scripts, they need to have permissions to do so to be able to read and look at the JSS. So this will be in here. If you want to look at the slides later, certainly all of this configuration information is in the README, so I won't insult your intelligence by instructing you on how to format a plist file full of stuff. I will insult your intelligence by showing you more amazing pictures. But most of this stuff we can just use defaults to do, okay? And we should. The problem, of course, is the repositories, which are a little more complicated. You can use plist buddy to do this, where you need to start doing arrays. Again, all this information is in the README, and it's going to be a little bit different for each organization. But I did want to point out, just to be careful, because we get a fair amount of issues on the AutoPkg issues, GitHub, on JSSImporter, on like random other projects that I've done that have no relation to it, about this very issue. So bash shell escaping and XML escaping are not the same. And I guess I should also say, and you need to worry about them. So if you have a password with an exclamation point, you need to use single quotes when you're doing your defaults write command. If you're going to just hand edit your preferences file, hopefully you know what you're doing and you understand about preference caching and all that other stuff. And you know to escape the reserved XML entities like a greater than and less than sign. I think that's all we need to say about that. There's two kinds of currently supported file share or distribution points for JSSImporter. One of them is file share distribution points, AFP or SAMA shares. Okay, and those are, again, automatically configured based on the information that you can get from the API. there is a endpoint for distribution points, which only has information about AFP and Samba shares. Fortunately, we've worked out how to do a JDS as well. And my suspicion is that cloud distribution points work exactly the same. I just don't have one, so I haven't been able to test it. So anyone who wants to experiment with that, I'd be happy to work with you on that and support more of these things. There is no API access to the JDS. It's something that we've had to figure out through Wireshark, watching Casper admin traffic. And will it continue to work forever? Who knows? Hopefully they will add API access to those things. They certainly know that people need it. Yeah, this is just the reminder. If you're going to hand edit those plist files, that you can't just save it and then go on your merry way. You have to do something that interacts with the default system to get it to update the cache. So we don't need to talk about that so much. So what it will probably look like is something like this. I have, at the moment, at our organization, we use file share repositories. We're switching to a JDS this summer, which is my exciting project for next week. Probably looks like something like this. The display name is what we're interested in. That's how we pull the information out of the distribution points API information and pair it with all the other information that it needs, the port, file share name, everything else. So the top left hand is what that ends up looking like. You can see where default's writing an array of dictionaries with 2 keys each would be probably difficult to do with the defaults. On the other hand, having a JDS, all you need to do is say, I have a repo and its type is JDS. The rest is done for you. And don't need to go super into detail about that. There's this other thing called AutoPkg-generated, which I strongly urge you to try out if you're at all nervous about this. You know, I think it's safe to say that when we go to conferences and we see all this new stuff, we'll probably say, you know, oh, this stuff is all really great, but I don't have time for that. My argument would be that you don't have time not to learn this stuff. And AutoPkg-generated is a really great gateway drug to getting really involved in AutoPkg. You know, there's a lot of software that still needs recipes, that still needs recipes cleaned up and fixed, and whatever way we can get more people involved in doing that stuff and looking at stuff and finding what's broken about it and making suggestions and everything else is great. So AutoPkg-generated is just a front end for AutoPkg. It makes it super easy and super easy to do Casper stuff. It has a button that says install JSSImporter. It'll nag you when JSSImporter has a new version, so you don't have to check periodically to see if there is a new version. You just hit that button, you watch a progress bar, which is great. It means you can drink coffee and listen to heavy metal or whatever it is that you do in your office while you wait for it. And the configuration of that has its own little pane on the folders and integration page. And it's pretty self-evident how you set it up. There's the API username and password, JSS URL, same as before. I felt almost like I needed to use the blur tool on David Bowie's package there. But it's an AutoPkg discussion, so it seems like we should probably leave it in. Great hair, though. Anyway. So, how do I actually go about using this crazy thing? So you probably need some recipes. That's how AutoPkg works. And as we've been discussing, there's a repository of JSS recipes available that is, again, I want to say pseudo-official. Anybody can write their own JSS recipes. There are certainly lots of JSS recipes available that in the AutoPkg organization that if you run AutoPkg search, Firefox, you might see 5 different JSS recipes. And the reason for that is that everybody's organization is different, and they don't all have the patience to wait for, you know, the official JSS recipe to come out, nor should there necessarily even be such a thing as an official JSS recipe. But this is our recommendation for what we think is a very safe, procedure to install, that workflow that we talked about before, that you can trust anything that comes from this repository to not do unpredictable things, that you need to audit every single part of that JSS recipe before you add it to your organization. You can say, you know what, I know all the other recipes in this repository, I can just add it and be on my merry way. So, super easy, AutoPkg repo add, JSS recipes, it'll go to the GitHub organization and find that, add it, and you're ready to go. And you can do AutoPkg search to find products that you're interested in. You can certainly just look in that folder and see what all recipes are there. You can look on GitHub. And you can certainly use other people's JSS recipes as well. Let's see. Right, here's an example. So I searched for NetHack. Only one deviant person has decided to make such a useless recipe. It's not even an application. It's a command line. I don't include the graphic user interface, because why would you need that? But just to give you an example of what does it look like when I say, hey, I want to search for a product. It's going to go out and look and see what all recipes are available. And the thing that we're probably looking for, again, to stick to this safe, known workflow, is that the repository is JSS recipes and that there is indeed a JSS recipe available. If not, you're going to need to write one, which is super simple. And we'll talk about that. But the other thing you need to do before you run these recipes is make sure that you have the parent recipes. So NetHack, being a good example, has a parent requirement of making the package. It doesn't come with the package recipe in the JSS recipe repo. It's not a good idea for us to duplicate all those parent recipes, because then the person who maintains the parent recipe makes a change to fix something, or they change the download URL or whatever. It could be a long time before somebody who works on the JSS recipes repo knows about that. So we need to make sure that we have those parent recipes, and one easy way to do that is to do AutoPkg-info and then the recipe you're interested in. So the example I have here is izip.jss, because I know that I don't have that in my organization. And sure enough, it couldn't find the parent recipe when I did that. If it gives you some information about that recipe, then you know that you have it. It doesn't give you that warning about can't find parent recipe. And certainly you can go and look at the recipe itself and see what is the parent recipe. I recommend you spend some time looking at the AutoPkg documentation to understand how the reverse domain naming works and how to find these things. But the next step you need to do is to just run the recipe, which is very simple. AutoPkg run the recipe.jss. Corn. So what happens? It's going to download a package. Presumably, it's going to run through all that stuff that happens prior to the JSS recipe. So it's going to download the product. It's going to make a package. Okay, now what? The first time you run it, it's going to create any categories that are missing if they don't already exist. It's going to copy the package to the distribution point. It's going to create extension attributes if they're needed. It's going to create static and smart groups as specified in the recipe. And in the official recipe repo, it's only going to create smart groups. Any scripts that are needed. And then finally, it creates the policy. And because of the way that it works, it's going to attach the icon. The next run, it's going to update things. If the package doesn't change, it doesn't update the package again. It's going to update all the other stuff because it's just text and it's not that much data, so that it is maintained in the state that you've specified in your recipes. Your recipes become the master source for this information. So if stuff gets out of sync, if somebody's goofing around in the web interface and they accidentally unclick something or intentionally click something, you can run this recipe again and it'll reset everything to the state you specified in the recipe. Which is an important point to make, that you don't want to edit these things manually. You have a question? Updates what by the...
Is it updating the policy again by the ID of the policy or the name of the
I honestly don't remember. Policies need to have unique names, so it shouldn't matter. Computers can have identical names. So computers have to be done by ID, but we're not hopefully editing properties of computers either manually. Does that answer your question? Kind of. Okay, yeah, we can chat about that. So this package ends up on your Casper server. Your testing group users are now able to install the packages. Hopefully they test it and give it a good run, and you're ready to promote it at some point. So the next part of this procedure is that you need to promote it. And as we've talked about before, manually that means changing the name, package, flushing the logs, etc. But here's where we talk about some more of the magical stuff. So JSS helper has a promotion verb that you can run, and you don't have to specify anything. This U is an extra flag that says I want to update the name of the policy. So for example, if I just run JSS helper promote, it's going to go out to my JSS. It's going to look for all the policies. It's going to try and find policies that install packages. Then it's going to try and see, okay, it installs a package. Are there other packages available, and are they newer? And because this is Python, we can do version comparisons. So it can actually figure that out. So what I get right off the bat is a number of policies that install software, some of which are AutoPkg managed things, some of which are false positives. But that's okay. So in this particular example, I wanted to update Adobe Flash Player. So I selected that policy. And the next thing it says is, okay, here's the package that's currently installing. What package do you want to replace it with? And it does a good job of guessing, you probably want the newest one. Maybe not, but that's the default. So I can just hit enter, and it's going to go ahead and swap which package is installed. It's going to update the name of the policy to reflect which version is installed. And finally, you get this little nag that says, remember to flush the policy logs. And as cheesy as it is, there's no way short of database access to flush the policy logs. So it's going to pop open a web page for you to click on that button. It's the best we can do. Yeah, well, either that or we can figure out how to do it in the database. That doesn't sound scary at all. I take the approach that I'm not going to wait for the features. I'm going to make it happen the best I can as it is. So just real brief, other stuff that you can do with JSS Helper. Here's the help page. You don't need to read that. I'm sure it's quite small. There's a couple things that I wanted to point out. If you wanted to just look at, hey, I want to see all the groups that are on my computer, it's a command line utility that allows you to crank that out rather than having to go into the JSS. Again, I don't like clicking on things. Not only does it show you, the whole list, you can see the actual XML for that group. So if I want to look at one of my AutoPkg JSS recipe created smart groups, I can do so. There's this thing, but again, that's clicking. And remember the Hasselhoff animation. But then it does a number of things that you can't do with JSS. There's this installs verb, and it takes wildcards. So I can say JSS helper installs Creative Cloud with the stars in it, and it's going to go out and say, show me all the policies which install something that has a name like Creative Cloud or has Creative Cloud in the name. And this is what we have at the moment. Certainly, it's an auditing tool, and it helps you, especially, again, in our organization, we're a department of 4. We're adding a 5th person, and everybody feels empowered to just dig into this stuff and set things up however they want. And it takes some looping back and auditing periodically to clean things up and try and get everything more standardized. The other thing that it does that's interesting is scoped. So I can say, here's a group. Show me all the policies that are scoped to that group. You can certainly go into a computer that you know is a member of a group and look at its record in the Casper web interface, but I prefer to do this. So it shows you all the policies it installs. It shows you in a separate group, here are all the policies that are scoped to all computers, since that's another scoping thing. And then also configuration profiles that are scoped to that group and to all computers. So these are all the things that are scopable that are applied to that group. Writing JSS recipes. We're going to breeze through this really quickly because writing JSS recipes is primarily about applying your already designed workflow to a new product. And that workflow is, what does your policy look like, basically? What is your smart group template? And because we're really pushing this JSS recipes repository and the workflow in that, I think that's a great reference. If you look at that style guide and discussion of that, it'll talk about how to set that stuff up. Got about 15 minutes, so I want to crank through this. If you take a policy and you design it in the web interface to do what you think you want it to do, you can export that XML with JSS Helper, for example, and use that to start writing your own template. This is the template that we use for the JSS recipes. And you can see with a little bit of eyeballing, here are the relevant things that we've been talking about. The frequency of being ongoing. There's the install, or the name. And you'll notice that we do text substitution so that we can use the same policy template for all of the recipes rather than having to write one template for each. This is not a template anymore. This is another Banksian innovation. You'll notice there's some comments in there because JSSImporter handles the scope, package configuration, scripts. So the only thing we're talking about here is what we want to set the frequency and how we want to configure self-service. And also there's this recon piece. Oh, I've got them arrowed. Nice. Smart group template we've looked at before, and I think this is what the template version looks like. So we've seen what it looks like for an actual group. This is what the template looks like. Again, we're text replacing the name of the product. How do you find it in the inventory? We're replacing the version with whatever AutoPkg just made. And the the computer group is testing. Writing the JSS recipe can be as simple as taking an existing one and editing those few fields which differ. And most software differs only in those things. We talked about this before and before that. It's the name, it's the category, description, identifier, parent recipe, okay? But most of these things, skipping right ahead, I'll save you the trouble. There is another project, JSS Recipe Creator. It allows you to specify a parent recipe. It'll take as much information from that parent recipe as possible. It'll use the policy and smart group templates that you have in place for your organization, and it will create that recipe for you. And in most cases, it does a great job. Sometimes you might need to go and then add a few things in because you can't just install what you get out of the AutoPkg recipe. But for most part, it does the job. So an example of running it, I've got the -A, which is an auto flag, and I say, here's my parent recipe. It's the ever-present NetHack package. The only things that it can't determine from that parent recipe are what category do you want it to have? What do you want it to say in self-service when somebody hovers over or hits the information button? And that's it. It does the rest of the work. So it figures out all the other stuff and it creates that XML file. There's all the things. If you don't do automatic, it will prompt you for each and every one of these settings if you really want to customize it. In the past, we've said, it's really easy to take a JSS recipe and override it to customize it to your organization's needs. Again, I'm really uptight about categories, and my categories are probably not going to be the same categories that you want to use, et cetera, et cetera. And in the past, we had some real issues about finding these template files and icons and things when you make an override, but the good news is that if you use the built-in override system to make a override recipe for a JSS recipe, it's going to work. You don't have to worry about copying files around. It knows how to find them now. And literally, here is an example of an override. Say that you disagree with the category that we've given to the JSS recipe for NetHack. Once you edit out all the stuff that doesn't need to change, you're left with just the things that you want to change. And in this case, it's just a category. It's not just a game, it's a sweet game. Briefly, another thing that we have to do a lot is install these applications that come from the App Store. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, and there's issues surrounding the licensing and stuff. But the way we do it at our school, and one way to do it, is to use the App Store app recipe. You need Nick McSpadden's recipe repository, and you need to do a little work to add some Python dependencies. But the magical thing is, if you have that repository added, you can create a JSS recipe that has that App Store app recipe as a parent, and you set the product names or the name property such that it is the actual file name of the application. And as long as that application is installed on the AutoPkg computer, it'll do all the rest of the work. So it's not relying on a package recipe in the same way. It's kind of magic. An example of that is, here is the pages recipe from the JSS repository. It's got the App Store recipe as the parent. I've set the OS requirements appropriately so that it won't try to install this on machines that can't run it. And the name is the important part, pages. That's how it finds it on the computer. Just a real brief, we've got about 8 minutes left. There are some other things, like people aren't completely happy with this workflow. They want to extend it or change it in some way. So that can be really simple, and it points out the strengths of this template system. One is some people, for some reason, want to automatically deploy packages to testing computers. Actually, the really confusing one is people who want to automatically download all auto-packaged packages to all computers, which is not really a great idea, as we've talked about the idea of development, testing, production. But they want to automatically deploy package to those testing computers. Maybe they have a test lab, or they have some people who they just want to flow those out to. That's a simple edit. You change your template in one place and change that so that it adds the check-in trigger. Okay. These examples are all available, so we don't need to talk about every little detail, but as I mentioned before, the University of North Carolina system has a federated JSS that serves tons of machines across multiple campuses, and they don't want anything created. They just want auto packages added to their distribution points without having to manually copy them themselves. And that's pretty simple as well. We take out all the different arguments in the recipe so that the only thing it does, it would look like this. The only arguments to the JSS importer are no arguments. It just copies the package. It'll use the configured distribution points. It won't make categories, smart groups, any of that other stuff. It safely puts that package there so somebody can manually create all the policies they want. Carpal tunnel themselves into oblivion. There's also the ability to run that in your recipe. You can run that JSS importer stage multiple times. So one interesting thing you can do with that is install that package to a testing JSS and another one to a different JSS. But that's crazy. The big one, I think, is that people like notifications. And they want to notify users, hey, you've got an update. Everybody likes to be nagged in the middle of a presentation or something. So the way you do that is you add a second argument or a second process, a JSS importer process, and you set it up so that it uses a different policy template. And that policy template calls another fine product from SheaCraig.com/DermAcademy called Yo, which is flaky at best due to the labyrinthine weirdness of Notification Center. Again, if anybody wants to contribute solutions to make this more solid, that's great. But the result is, once your computer recons and finds out that it has NetHack is out of date, and this is actually a bad example because NetHack doesn't have a version and it's never going to update, but you knew right away. Somebody plays a lot of NetHack. Once it sees that it's in that group, the next time it checks in, it's going to run this policy, which says, hey, just run this notification utility. You can configure the actions and the icon and everything else. If you click on that install button, it opens up self-service, and you could even say, you know what, make this a featured policy so that it shows up on the front page. We've talked about AutoPkg a little bit before. I should have another caption on this that says this is not the actual Elliot Jordan or James Barclay or any of those other guys. But it's a really great stepping stone. Again, if you're at all considering using this, I highly recommend grabbing it because it makes it super easy to do so. And it allows you to easily say, hey, I'm interested in all these recipes. Just do it for me periodically so you don't have to have any intervention. And certainly I put up there that you can make a launch daemon that does this, but that kind of defeats the purpose of the AutoPkg thing. Briefly, I wanted to talk about a couple other things because, again, I'm just shilling my products. Eventually, you end up with tons and tons and tons of Chrome and Firefox and whatever else packages. I have another thing called Spruce. It uses Python JSS. Right now, what it does is it looks for packages that are on your distribution points or on your Casper server that are not used by any policies or configuration or imaging profiles, imaging configurations. Those should be fairly safe to remove. It also looks for scripts that are not used. And there are more features coming, so we're hoping to add the ability to find groups which have no members, which may not necessarily be a problem, but it might be the smell of something that could be cleaned out. I like my JSS to be super clean, and so this helps me. An example of running it is, here's just the top. Atom has a ton of updates, Adobe Flash Player, a fair amount of updates, and you can just have it report. It won't do anything on its own. If you're wild and crazy, you can have it just clean all that stuff in one run with no intervention, which sounds like madness. You can also pipe all this stuff into a text file, and then you can edit just to make a list of, here's the stuff I want to remove, run that as the input to Spruce, and it will remove all that unnecessary, unused stuff. And finally, some things that I'm looking forward to in the future is using JSS recipes to do things that it probably shouldn't be doing, but maybe a good way to solve, or not solve, but to share some of these solutions. So, extension attributes that find the general version number of Microsoft Office products, for example. Or, another thing is save and throw, which helps detect and remove adware on computers. So they're not really products, they're not really packages, but things that could be installed automatically and could be shared, much like extension attributes are on Jamf Nation. This is my final awesome slide. And we have 3 seconds for questions, so go. There is no harm, and that's a great question. I do find that there is this weird thing where people really like to install the same package over and over and over again. So there's certainly no reason why you need to take it away. It has more to do with the fact that the way that you have to trick it into managing the software so that it's only available when it's out of date works. It makes sense when you look at the way it plays out. So it has to be ongoing, because otherwise you have to flush the policy log every time you update a package, which defeats the whole purpose of automating it in the first place. We can't access that. Could you leave the person in the smart group? Yeah, you could just remove the recon. Eventually the computer's going to recon anyway, though, and drop out.
The recon makes sense. Let's say the policy fails or they get the image.
Right. Well, if the policy fails, they will be able to install it again, because they won't fall out of the smart group. So unlike a frequency of once, if once fails, you have to flush the policy logs before it runs again. With ongoing, but scoped to a smart group, it'll run over and over and over again until it successfully meets the requirements of not being in the smart group, if that makes sense.